My name is John Brink. I'm the CEO of the Brink Group of Companies in Prince George, British Columbia. We are a company that have really three silos of our operation. The main one is lumber manufacturing. The one is warehousing and logistics, and another one is real estate, residential, commercial, and industrial. The main operations are lumber manufacturing, and as some of our listeners may already know, I've been quite vocal about the forest industry in British Columbia, in particular in terms of the opportunities that exist, although the last number of years have been, to say the least, a challenge. And we became in particular aware of this already, if you look back to around the 2000 area when the region here was adversely affected by the pine beetle epidemic, which virtually destroyed all the lodgepole pine in the interior of the province. In fact, some research and studies were done in terms of the economic impact at the time. I believe the report was done August 2021, forecasted by Jim Chavan and Rob Schultz, that up to 35 sawmills would shut down likely permanent, in the interior of British Columbia. The other forecast was that from the sustainable jobs of 200,000 jobs in the industry, it probably would be reduced by about half that. In the interior, the allowable cut will be dramatically reduced, they concluded, by the mountain pine beetle in investigation. And on the coast, a sizable chunk of the coastal annual allowable cut has been lost to new parks in protected areas. The forecast at the time was shocking to a lot of people, but it has proven to be reality. Reality is still coming home to us. Another announcement was made here in the last day, where Canfor announced that their sawmill operations in Chetwynd and in Houston, the one in Chetwynd will be closed permanently, and the one in Houston at least likely for the next 2 years, when they are contemplating rebuilding smaller sawmills affecting close to 400 jobs. And those again are jobs that are considered to be direct jobs. What we use normally is between 2.5 and 3 jobs per direct job. So over 1,000 or 1,200 jobs. I believe the number was 490 jobs actually between Chetwynd and Houston. So close to 1,500 jobs gone. And at least for now, and the ones in Chetwynd in particular, likely permanent. A couple of weeks before that, Prince George Pulp made an announcement of their pulp line would be shut down permanently in Prince George, affecting again 300 jobs permanently. When I first came to Prince George in 1965, those mills had just been built. The industry was booming throughout northern BC, and in the jobs, in particular in the pulp mills and the other sawmills, while the mills already then were in transition, consolidating. The industry was booming to say the least, and the future looked extremely bright. There likely will be more sawmills shut, both in the interior and down the coast. The other one, the formula that is usually used, 4 to 5 sawmills means 1 pulp mill. And again, those jobs and the multiplies will be devastating to the cities that rely on them. In particular in northern British Columbia, I'm looking at McKinsey, Chetwynd, obviously, Houston, Burns Lake, Vanderhoof. In addition to all of that, unfortunately, there are also value-added manufacturers, and there are not many left of them. And again, I was extremely involved in value-added manufacturing, and believe that we can do more with the fiber and make more products for new markets, and believe that there is an opportunity for investment in value-added manufacturing. I believe that for the last 60 years and before that, before I came to Canada, I started this company, Brink Forest Products, which is known as a value-added manufacturer. We have been in operation for 50 years, being innovative in the products that we have manufactured. We operated mainly in the location where we are now, which is downtown Prince George in the CNR site. We operated a remanufacturing plant. What is that? Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because with all the comments that have been made, including mine, I'm sometimes assuming that the public understands the difference between primary, secondary, value-added, non-value-added, and I just want to make sure that I'm trying to be clear about what it really means. Is that in the industry in British Columbia, we have different operations. The one, the primary manufactured, most of them, if not all, have tenure. What is tenure? Tenure is renewable forest licenses where they are allowed to cut a certain volume of lumber that is consistent with the amount set aside by the province. How does that work? Well, in the province of British Columbia, we grow the annual allowable cut that has been in the area of about 60 million cubic meters annually. Most of that is already committed in some form or fashion. It used to be pretty much the 60 million, fairly steady at that level until the pine beetle pandemic happened. The other part that happened is the forest fires 2018-2019, then recently announced policy changes that dealt with the deferral of old growth timber that has further reduced the amount of annual allowable cut. Other policy changes have been where more of the forest is dedicated to First Nations, and correctly so, that will share in access to the forest as well as access in the revenue. Another additional one falling in that category has been blueberry in northeastern BC, which again took a certain amount of fiber that was set aside for First Nations. So that has resulted in the prediction of Jim Javan and Rob Schultz made in 2021, the volume of annual allowable cut of timber in the province of British Columbia down to around 40 million cubic meters annually. Now, the other thing to understand is that there is a difference between the coast and the interior. The interior primarily is spruce and lodgepole pine, with some cedar, very minor, and Douglas fir, some, where the coast distinctly different is mainly cedar and Douglas fir and hemlock. Different operations, different products that they manufacture. My focus will be also on the coast, but mainly on the interior as we go a little bit further in explaining where we were, where we are. In terms of the primary manufacturing sector that has tenure, rely on that timber to have a continuous, predictable source of raw material. Now, where BC is uniquely different from a lot of other manufacturing areas in the United States or in Europe or in other places, is where most of the timber is owned by companies or private individuals or companies of some structure or another. Where in BC, 96% of the timber is owned by you and me, the people. That makes it distinctly different. The incumbent government of the day is the one that sets policy or makes policy changes in terms of what should happen to that resource. So they may adjust the annual allowable cut, or they may make changes as they did with the deferrals, the old growth forest, by setting aside more of the timber that was considered to be old growth. They did that. And the other one would be the allocation of timber to First Nations. And a lot of this was done during the period of June 2021, when the then government of the day, the NDP, under the Premier John Oregon, together with the Minister of Forest, Catherine Conroy, announced the intentions paper. The intention paper was endorsed by stakeholder groups. The one was First Nations, spoke to it. The second group was labor, and the third group was industry. I was asked to be speaking to it, which I did. And what I indicated is that I believe that the objective of government was to have more involvement of First Nations, to set aside or recognize old growth forest, and the third one was, very importantly, to incent investment in secondary manufacturing by others that were interested in going up the value chain. I agreed with that, and I believe that I endorsed the objectives of the government to do that. Now, nearly 2 years later, and a lot of contemplation that has happened, I'm very disappointed in where the government has gone forward with the intentions paper, and in particular as it relates to the value-added sector. Now, to put things into perspective, I've talked about the primaries. The view I have of the primary sector, that access to timber is a privilege, belongs to the people of the province. With it go certain obligations, including social obligations, where timber that is manufactured in certain or harvested in certain regions should be also, wherever possibly, manufactured in those regions. And it was a critical part to the social contract and the obligation of getting the privilege of access to timber. So the 10-year system in the province of British Columbia, where timber is allocated, the amount of timber set aside for harvesting is around the 60 million cubic meters annually, and was around that area for a long time, until there was the pine beetle infestation that destroyed the lodgepole pine in the interior, a number of fires, then reallocation of fiber, which affected adversely the volume available for further manufacturing. And as a result, resulted in a number of mills shutting down, and as well as pulp mills. So the concept of making timber available and to tenured companies and renewable forest license, there was a social obligation attached to that, and the concept of appurtency, meaning that the timber harvested in the region would be manufactured in that region. The other thing that had happened to the forest industry, and other reason for the topic today, is that we saw more and more value-added manufacturing. And if you look back all the way to the changes in the forest industry, and something unique to the forest industry is that years and years ago, in the 40s, 50s, around the Prince George area in the region here, there were as many as 600 sawmills, all small mills, mainly going in the bush, cutting the timber, cutting the lumber, and then bringing it in to Prince George to be dressed and then sent to the market. Because of government legislation that demanded that if you have access to the timber, then there has to be close utilization. That meant that government was attracting chip or pulp manufacturers and made fairly major concessions to them in terms of access to timber, and committed those that were harvesting timber that they had to chip the residuals of the log and then sell them to the pulp mills. Now, in a lot of cases, if you have a round log and we cut it into lumber, then rough and dirty speaking, up to 40% of that log likely will end up as side lumber or becoming residuals. Obviously, the effect of all of that meant that the companies, the small companies, had to install debarkers and chippers. In a lot of cases, they were not able to do that because it would cost them 10 times more than the value of the mill to invest. So a lot of those mills, if they had tenure, they sold it to bigger companies. That started this cycle of consolidations and centralizing the operations. And I'm thinking in particular at the time that I first came here in 1965. The other thing that became interesting is that more and more people looked at opportunities of secondary manufacturing as it applies to lumber. So value-added companies that saw an opportunity of becoming a manufacturer of lumber, in particular as it related to lumber manufacturing, finding areas in which they could acquire lumber and finding different products. And Brink started his operation in October 1975. And we bought the lower quality lumber, and the lower quality then represented about between 10 and 15% of the volume that was manufactured that had defects not suitable for normal building, and we would process it, cross-cut it, and then manufacture it into higher grade products. I was one of the entrepreneurs, typical for an entrepreneur, that had to find a way of what to do with the short pieces. I introduced finger jointing, where we have short pieces of lumber, glued them together and made longer pieces. It was quite a battle, but I developed a company out of it, and still today we are probably one of the largest, if not the largest, finger joint manufacturer in Canada, if not North America. Low-grade remanufacturing unfortunately disappeared, and because of government policy more than anything. In 2005, a company like us that had then already been in business for 30 years had become very involved in forming a value-added manufacturing group to give us representation on the dialogue with government, with the federal government, negotiations on duties and all of those kind of things. I was able to become the founding president of an organization called the BC Council of Value Added Wood Processors. 8 associations, 800 companies that were operating throughout British Columbia. An amazing number of companies that employed thousands and thousands of people. I saw that as the future of the industry with a lot of growth. Unfortunately, the then government of the day, the BC Liberals in 2003, changed a number of policies. The one was that the concept of a permanency would disappear. The other one, in terms of consolidation of companies, could be stimulated, and more companies bought other people's tenure. And for the value-added sector that had been able to negotiate already in the early 90s, and I was very much part of that, to make the argument with government that if you want to attract investment in value-added manufacturing, then there must be a reasonable expectation of access to fiber. If you don't have that, you will not get investment in value-added manufacturing. The government of that time, amazingly also the NDP government, in particular Premier Harcourt and Premier Glenn Clark at the time, agreed with us and made available to secondary manufacturers 20% of the annual allowable cut of timber in the province of British Columbia. So what it did, it stimulated a level playing field of creating the incentive of stimulating value-added manufacturing. Unfortunately, the then government in 2003 changes to forest policy eliminated that very effective lobbying by the major primaries, obviously, and as a result of that, in 2002, 2003, what started the process of secondary manufacturers throughout the province disappearing. Then the other part that became a major part is that government can become very effective on being inefficient, is where they started giving out major amounts of money to create new markets for lumber in other places, in particular China. And that sounds like a good idea. Unfortunately, they were looking for all the low-grade lumber. So what happened, all those companies that relied on the low-grade lumber lost that volume because it was all dumped into China. Why do I say dumped into China? Well, in a lot of cases, they would sell it at a lower price in China than they could sell it here. In fact, what had happened during the process is they had the primaries made sure that that secondary manufacturers would not compete with them in China for the lumber that they had been buying from the primaries. So they raised the prices from the secondaries for low-grade lumber by about 20%. Very common practice to make sure that they would not compete. The other part that was this third part that became the nail in the coffin of secondary manufacturing was that although I had in my role as the president or the chair of the BC Council Value Added Wood Process very aggressively being involved in making sure that the Americans were charging duties on the lumber manufactured in BC or Canada and charge them a penalty for access to their markets. Through some very difficult negotiations, we were able then to negotiate that duties would only apply for secondary manufacturers that had no timber and had arm's length relationships with primaries, would only apply to the input. So, give me an example. Well, if the input cost of raw material was $100 and you added in value because of the unique products that you manufactured $200, $300, or $400 to it, then if it was $300, then it would be $400. If the duty was 20%, you would pay $80 to the finished products or $20 to the inputs. That part was absolutely critical. I was involved in number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. And number 4 I was not involved in. That started in the early 80s. Number 5, a group formed by the BC Lumber Trade Council, which is about 10 companies exclusively, got the go-ahead from the BC government to negotiate softwood lumber. It did not include secondary manufacturers. It included 5 of the larger companies and then 5 other ones, and there was no room for secondaries to be involved, and either by accident or on purpose did not include protecting secondary manufacturers, who then would have to pay up to 20% duties on the lumber they manufactured. So where are we now with value-added manufacturing as it applies to lumber? Well, since there is no access to timber anymore, because all the timber that was set aside in the small business program developed in the early 90s became, by government legislation, BCTS, BC Timber Sales. What is BC Timber Sales? BC Timber Sales represents about 20% of the annual allowable cut, and it has 2 categories to it. The one is category 1, anybody can bid on it, and category 2 should have been and was minor. Category 2 is exclusive for people that can prove that they are secondary manufacturers. That really never developed. And so, that is the one that all of a sudden that was no longer available. Add to that aggressive marketing and finding markets for products that normally were manufactured by secondary manufacturers in BC, nothing to do with the price. In fact, they would pay more, but government supported that, and obviously, the people that represented the major primaries were very efficient, very effective, and pulling the wool over their eyes, and they just forked out millions and millions of dollars. We have never seen a nickel of that money, nor has anybody ever represented us in the marketplace. The third one, obviously, is that the duties, and in order to show people the effect of it, that since 2017, this company, Brink Forest Products alone, has paid $65 million in duties. We have no timber. We never had a nickel from government. We have no relationship with major tenure holders, but we became what we call collateral damage. Did government do anything about it? I don't think they really care. And I say that with care because I've raised the issue many, many, many times, and so far with no effect. So what did that all do then to value-added manufacturing or secondary manufacturing, as I describe it, the ones that depend mainly on lumber? It eliminated at least 2/3 of them, so there are virtually no one left in secondary manufacturing. Maybe 3 or 4 companies in northern BC. So if I look now at BC, 90% of the lumber manufactured in BC comes from north of Hope. There is no secondary manufacturing. I had hoped that in June of 2021, when the Premier then announced the intentions paper, together with the then Minister for the Forest, Catherine Conroy, I was excited about it because it meant modernizing the forest industry in British Columbia. Because so far we had been critical about it because 5%, 5, 6 companies, 7 companies control probably 70%, 75% of all the annual allowable cut. If you control 75% of the annual allowable cut, you control it all. Because the prices are substantially lower than the market prices. So it's easily for you to access the incremental wood available in the open market, pay a premium for it because it guarantees you that nobody else will buy it because they cannot compete with you. So the deck is stacked. That's basically where we are. I was excited about that because to hear the Premier stand up, then John Oregon, and saying they wanted to modernize the forest industry, and one of the main keys was obviously by law, more of the timber would flow to First Nations, that they would share in the revenue. I agree with all of that. I think it's huge potential. They did whatever they said in regards to deferrals of old growth, and I look at old growth like trees this big and 2,000 feet tall or whatever. Once you see it, you know it. But that part went too far. We are now, because of the other interpretation, and I'm not an expert in those areas, but I'm simply saying what I understand, is that you can have a tree about that big around, it's 150 years old in the interior, and because it's 150 years old, it's considered to be old growth. I guess, in my opinion, it went too far. I believe it should be looked at, it should be changed to make, because it has stifled access to timber for the larger companies. And do not get me wrong, I'm not beating up on large companies. I'm simply saying that I believe that to have a successful primary sector, it is to the benefit of communities to have secondary manufacturing and combination. You cannot have healthy secondary manufacturing unless you have a profitable primary. Right now in the province of British Columbia, we are not competitive, and changes have to be made to make us again competitive on the international market. And looking at this as hope, not only for us, but more for attracting investment in value-added manufacturing in the province, in the communities like Mackenzie, Chetwynd, Houston, Burns Lake, and Vanderhoof, of more value-added manufacturing and other ideas. It has become obvious that, again, the issue is the same, that the COFI in particular, representing primarily the majors. I believe I'm the only member of COFI that has not tenure. Amazingly, I've been on the board longer than anybody else. I'm also the vice chair. But anytime the issue comes up in terms of access to fiber and value-added manufacturing, I take off my cap and I say, I'm now here as a value-added manufacturer, not as a member of COFI. And my position may well be different, and in fact is different than theirs. Right now we are on the point, and an announcement was made here, I believe 2 days ago or so, by the Minister of Forest. I've made the argument many times. Is what are the issues? That still the same remains. Why would anybody want to invest in the province of British Columbia if there is no reasonable expectation of access to fiber? That's my argument. It will still flow to the primaries. Well, why? What is their problem then? Why are they against that? Well, it's very simple. Because they want to control it, one, and they want to control the cost. Because they feel likely that if secondaries have it, the costs may go up, because that if they then interact with them, we want to buy their lumber at market price, then they should be buying the timber that we have also at market price. That's likely one of the issues. Obviously, they have been successful by the announcement that was made 2 days ago. I wasn't very happy about it, and I'm not in the habit of doing that, but I was very, if you want to watch my podcast that I did 2 days ago, where I got the announcement during the time that I was podcasting, I'm going to say this, I was pissed, to put it lightly. And it's not about me, it's not about us, I don't even want any of it. I'm saying that for the province of British Columbia, if we want to attract more manufacturers, value added, there has to be a reasonable expectation of fiber. What the government just did, together with the help of COFI, is saying there is no opportunity for value added in the province of British Columbia. End of message. So, where do we go from here? I believe, and I will show you a document that I use quite a few times. It is comparing Sweden, who are very similar to us in Canada in terms of size, 22 million hectares, that they have volumes that they are logging and used to log that were the same as with us, gone through a difficult period 20, 30, 40 years ago. They decided to grow more forest per hectare. The other part is interesting about it, actually, but I heard from my friend Jan Hedberg, who I podcasted a couple of weeks ago, and you should look at it. The pine that they replanted came from BC. It was more effective for them than the PC that they were growing. But they grow more volume per hectare, 50, 60, 70, 80% more than we do. And in fact, they went through the place where they had also too much capacity, shut down many mills, then had intensive forestry, then they started to plant more wood, and then as we are now in the midterm, then found themselves they are now approaching 80 to 90 million cubic meters annually. The problem they have now, not enough capacity. They are, and I was there when I worked in Holland, and seeing secondary manufacturing, they are very, very good at secondary manufacturing. If you want to give me one. IKEA as one, but there are many others. They became very, very good at it. So what does it look like, John, as we go forward, in my opinion? And I'm not claiming to be an expert, but I've been doing this for 60 years. I have a passion for Canada, for BC, and for the industry, and I become very upset if we screw it up and that we deny the opportunities for us to develop an industry that has such immense potential, because we got it all. I believe there will be further shutdowns, including the one that we just had recently. 2, 3, 4 maybe between the interior and the coast. Obviously, there will be further curtailments on the pulp side. There is virtually no value-added sector left, so I'm not having much hope for any new ones coming in. And obviously, government here, with the message they send, it is, if they push forward with this, which they likely will, and I will put them on notice, they are misleading in letting people believe that there is an opportunity. There isn't. So what I'm simply saying to the communities in northern British Columbia, 90% of the lumber manufactured in northern British Columbia, north of Hope, is the total volume of BC. That the communities like Mackenzie, Fort St. James, Vanderhoof, Houston, Chetwynd, Fort Nelson, on, Prince George, Quesnel, have to stand up and saying, enough, enough. And I believe the time has come to do that. I can be so vocal about it. It's not me. I don't need it. I put government on notice with the little bit of wood that they want to make available, 600,000 cubic meters. That will not even support one single small sawmill for the whole province of British Columbia. It's a joke. And so what I'm saying, no, I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to sit back here, but at the same time, I have an obligation to explain. But I believe this, and I say that respectfully, the issues are complicated to a certain extent, and for some. And I will be on the record as that's the way I see it. The opportunities are huge. I believe that, are we good stewards to the resource? Yes, we are. Can we do better? I believe we can. Can we be like Sweden, where we're growing 50, 60, 70% more fiber than we are doing now? Yes, we can. And how long will it take? 40, 50 years maybe. Too long for me maybe, but if you look at it, stand back, then it's not a long time. That's our obligation to the future. In terms of now, I still believe that more value-added manufacturing can be done. I believe that up to 2 days ago. I think this government changed that, and I hope that another government will stand up and saying, okay, we will not accept that. And I would also hope that I believe that the future of the industry, and I've said it on the record, is the way I see the industry. The forest industry, the sawmills in the industry will become smaller. They will be more regional, less volume, more focused on the profile of timber in the areas. There will be more technology, robotics, electronic, computerized, involved. And here's the key. They will employ many less people in sawmills. That's what it will look like. That's what I say. The future is innovative primary, in combination with intensive secondary. Where are the opportunities? Intensive secondary. Still, I believe that today, although unfortunately this government has said we don't care and we don't want to rock the boat because we're scared of the other guys not supporting us, or God only knows what. But in any event, that I still believe that the future is in secondary manufacturing, and I still believe that today. And what will happen in secondary manufacturing? I believe that the lumber that will be manufactured by the sawmills of the future, 50% of the volume will go up the value chain. 20%, 25% of the lower quality, and 25% of the higher quality. Companies like us that have invested here, operated for 50 years, employed 400 people, don't cut a single tree. We want to double in size. We want to do mass timber. We want to do a lot of things up the value chain. But we alone cannot do that. I say open the door, invite investors, because they will look at our location here, NBC, and the forest that we have, and the location that we have, the transportation that we have, cost of operating, electricity, and all of those. We have plenty. We are competitive globally, and it can be attractive. But if we tell them there is no access to fiber, you will not get any investment. So I'm trying to be positive because I believe still very much so in BC. I still very much believe in the forest industry. But I cannot stand back and watch this and misrepresent it and mislead people in thinking what the government announced together with Kofi is good for the industry. It isn't. And the communities have to stand up, speak out, should the people. I cannot do it alone. And, but I will keep being vocal about it. I believe in the industry, and I hope my explanation at least will be helpful. Thank you very much.